What's going on, guys? It's Bromley at Empire Barbell, and today I want to talk about the glutes. Now, specifically, I want to go over a few of my favorite approaches for dealing with glute activation issues. It's something that occurs with a lot of people, especially newer trainees and people that have sedentary lifestyles. I've dealt with my share of accountants, tattoo artists, office workers, people who spend a lot of time sitting, and when you sit all day, every day, the glutes get loose and inactive, the hip flexors get tight. That's a very common pathology that you see. So glutes are the backbone of everything we do. They're integral in squatting, deadlifting, and pretty much anything that's involved in keeping you upright. So it's really important, not just that they're doing the minimum viable amount of work, but that you are actually optimizing them to get the most out of your lifts. So one of my favorite approaches are marches. Every time you take a step, you are contracting the glute and taking on the full load and then releasing it, allowing it to relax. These type of quick fire tactics, contraction followed by relaxation, it causes a lot of blood to get drilled into the muscle. And because you're working for so long, we'll do these for 45 seconds, a minute, up to a minute and a half. That's a lot of time that really allows you to build up a substrate deficit. So once you start to get through the marches, you feel the glutes start burning. That causes a certain amount of receptivity. I like to do these with bands. You don't need a hip belt squat. You can rig these up if you have a dip belt, a couple boxes to stand on, and a loading pin or dumbbell, and you can do the same thing. Attaching bands in a squat rack on the floor of the squat rack is another good variation. You can set up a lot of band tension with just a few bands. Clip it to the band, stand up, march away. Again, a minute plus. With something like this, you can go for days. So for people that have a hard time feeling their glutes on very glute heavy movements, kettlebell swings, glute bridges, this is a quick and dirty way to get them lit up. See, I've been marching for 20 seconds. I already start to feel them go. If you're feeling sadistic, you can load it to the front as well, just for a little extra stimulus. I'll have my clients hold on to a med ball, march away, and then they got to wait for me to give them the okay that the torture's over. So that brings up an important point about receptivity. I talked about using methods that get a lot of blood into the glutes. So if we have a way of training the glutes where we can drive blood into the muscle and trap it there, it's going to create a very aggressive substrate deficit, and it's going to burn. It's going to burn like shit. Now, when it starts to burn, you become aware of them. You get that receptivity. Bodybuilders call it the mind-muscle connection. Well, guess what, powerlifters? You need the same thing. You need to be aware of how your body is moving and what muscles are contributing to what phases of the movement. So if your glutes are dead, if you're not aware of them, if you don't know how to squeeze them, if you don't feel them during certain movements, they need to be woken up, and this is a fantastic way to do it. Now, weighted glute bridges on a bench are a very common method that people use to attack their glutes. As your hips come up, the glutes are at peak contraction. One of the reasons I scoff at people that think glute activation isn't a real issue is that I have had people hold glute bridges for a minute plus to feel absolutely nothing in their glutes, but their hamstrings and erectors were absolutely on fire. So it stands to reason that if you have people who are very, very efficient and very good at recruiting muscle tissue, in the sense of people that have high rate of force development, people that have a high ability to recruit their available muscle fibers in the form of maximal strength, it stands to reason that people would also, on the other end of the bell curve, have a very poor ability to do that. And we know that movement dysfunction exists. We know that people who are sedentary, who don't use their body on a regular basis, they develop movement dysfunction patterns, and that's basically miscommunication, it's improper coordination. And that's what a lot of this stuff is designed to do. We're just getting the muscles to talk to each other a little bit better. Well, we're getting you to talk to your muscles a little bit better in hopes that they talk to each other. So yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me that there would be some mechanism that would prevent muscles from being inactive when they are never used. So this is a perfect sign that that phenomenon exists. And to that extent, I've had people do dozens and dozens of glute bridges, focusing on holding, isometric, squeezing at the top, experimenting with bands versus dumbbells and barbells. And I've had people who have had really a lack of ability to get their glutes to wake up in that position. So one of the hacks that I do, instead of starting off on a bench with weight, starting off on the ground, toes up on your heels, and you want to think about knees out. To make it a little more difficult, you could put a band around your knees, but you don't need to at the start. And all you're going to do is drive your shoulders back into the ground and push your glutes up. So right off the bat at the top, you're going to feel a much more full contraction in the glutes, and holding that squeeze at the top will increase receptivity, and it will build a substrate deficit a little bit faster, a little bit more of an intense burn as you start to fatigue. And again, we're getting blood in, we're causing fatigue, we're causing receptivity. So not only are we trying to grow the muscle, but we're trying to make you aware of the muscle as it works. We're trying to build that sense of connection to it so you can feel it contract. So if we end up in a heavy lift where really firing the glutes, like the lockout of a deadlift, super important, you have to be aware of it as you go into it to really get any benefit out of it. So this is stepping stones. This is something you would want to do. Make sure you feel it, make sure you're aware of it before you go off and try to do weighted movements, because you could be hip thrusting 500 pounds. If your glutes are not part of the equation, that just means you're feeding into that movement dysfunction. So this next one's pretty straightforward. Helps if you have a hip circle. You don't need one, but the little bit of resistance to push your knees out against really does help with this one. So you're gonna see a theme in glute training is banding the knees. And the reason is that the glutes they're really important in hip extension. Anything you do that opens up the hip, the glutes are main movers. So you're looking at anytime you squat, anytime you lock out a deadlift, kettlebell swing, anything that involves extending the hip, the glutes are there. The glutes also move your knees out from your body. They're involved in abduction. So if you're squatting and you have this cue where you push your knees out, you should feel the glutes tense up as you do that. And guys do that to kind of prime their glutes to fire out of the hole. And it also builds mechanical tension. So you're winding up, so it's almost like squatting into a spring. It helps build a little torque in the hips. Similarly to when you come down, when you torque into a bar as you bench press, you try to build that tension in your shoulders. So a really good way to build up the glutes and build up that receptivity is through abduction, because there is nothing else that moves the knee out to the side. If you're taking steps to the side against resistance, you can be certain your glutes are firing. Now this is a hard part. You want to maintain a quarter squat the entire time. I do have a hard time with clients with this one because the second their quads start to burn, they'll stand up. You have to stay squatted down. Keep that outward tension against the bands, nice and upright, and you want to take nice, even steps side to side. You don't have to overextend, but make sure you're maintaining that knee tension against the band. Do not let your knees collapse. If the band is so tight that it causes that, you might need to go lighter or even start out without any type of resistance until you get down. So every time you come out to the side, that glute is firing to bring your knee out, and you are maintaining that tension throughout every step. This is another one where you want to dig a little bit longer than you normally would in a set. There's no reason that you can't do these side steps for 45 seconds per side, minute and a half total. That's perfectly reasonable. It's not overly systemically draining. You are going to feel your glutes burn. You are going to feel them light up, but that's the goal. So to condition these muscles, sometimes it takes a little more work, a little more effort before they really start getting recruited. So you're not just going to be able to go for 20, 30 seconds and call it good. You want to get into that later threshold. Go for a minute, go for a minute and a half. Try to push it each time and make sure the entire time you're fighting for that receptivity. You want to feel those glutes fire with every step. Now, the number one method for fixing glute activation issues, which is not going to be the most popular, but it is damn well the most important, and that is applying glute activation to every single lift you ever do. The glutes are such a keystone muscle because they are involved in just about everything we do. If you're upright, they're being used. If you're engaging in hip extension, they're being used. If you're moving your legs out to the side, they're being used. And that describes just about every athletic activity you could do, just about every weight room activity you could do. They are hugely important. So if you go in and you're doing a milquetoast warm-up without any type of purpose, without cycling through any type of cues, you're really losing out on a huge opportunity to drill in these good movement patterns to eventually turn yourself into a technical lifter. So knowing that the glutes are primarily involved in hip extension, and we do so much hip extension, every time you extend your hips, you should be trying to drill in that hinge action. Now, a big problem that people have, when you talk about hinging, you think, okay, we're moving the hip independently of the knee. That's easy enough to conceptualize. I tend to think of the top half, which most people are guilty of, and that's not moving the hip independently from the spine. So most people with movement pattern dysfunctions, I said earlier, having clients do things like glute bridges, and they feel it in their erectors. They have this kind of melding of movement patterns where other structures start to take over movements that they should not be. So to that end, we're trying to isolate the hips so that the glutes and only the glutes are really getting targeted in these movements. So if you have a habit where if you bend at the hip or if you break at the hip, you have movement in your spine where your erectors end up going through a stretch shortening cycle, simple hip hinge movements are going to give you a back pump. So if you get a back pump warming up for deadlifts, if you get a back pump during squats, it's a good sign that your erectors are going through a stretch shortening cycle where they should be locked in. They should be contracting isometrically. So practicing as part of your warm up, even if you have to go to a broomstick, practice the bracing. We've got the breathing and bracing book linked in the description. Take it, read it, live by it. It's going to be the best thing you ever do. Learning to lock in, keep your midsection tight, and getting it to contract and brace independently of everything else so that your hips are allowed to move without any interference from other structures. Your spine should be braced. These muscles are to resist movement, not create movement. So if you're adequately resisting movement and you're allowing yourself to hinge properly, your glutes are going to be taking on the full brunt of the movement. That's what we're going for. So if you have a barbell in your hands, you're warming up for a deadlift. Every time I warm up for a deadlift, I'm cueing the brace, ribs down, abs tight. I'm maintaining posture. I have my hips tucked under, and I start with my glutes clenched. I do not initiate a movement until they're tight. And then once they're tight, I break, I hinge, right? So I'm just moving at the hip, and I am conceptualizing that my hip and only my hip is locking that weight out. I have no movement in my spine. In fact, right now my abdominals are braced like I'm about to take a punch. I call it cannonball breathing. Remember that every time you start a squat, a deadlift, even a press, tighten everything up as if you're about to get hit in the stomach. We're not taking the big breath and shoving the abs out. We're bringing everything in. We have the hips under, we have the ribs down, right? Facing the diaphragm to the pelvic floor. Your body, it's like a can of biscuits, right? Don't break your biscuits. Keep everything stacked. And once you do, when you allow your hips to break independently of your spine and you squeeze them to fire your hips into the bar, you are going to feel how they contribute to all of these power movements and athletic movements. So now we're really getting evolved, right? We did all these things to get familiar with how the muscle moves so we can feel the muscles contribute. Once we have that down pat, now we're going for movement patterns. And you want those to be automatic. You don't want to have to go into a big deadlift and think, is my spine giving? Am I not braced properly? So every single warm up you do, isolate those glutes. You isolate those glutes by taking your midsection out of the equation. Lock it down, brace tight, practice over and over and over and over. And before you know it, as you go in to lock out a big deadlift, you're not going to have to think twice about it. You're not pulling up, you're pulling your hips right into the bar. And that means the glutes, it's just like doing a standing glute bridge. That means those glutes are firing and the hips are coming out into the bar. And that is when you're going to be a fully realized technical lifter. So of course, we just scratched the surface here. There's plenty of different exercises and cues and tips I could give in this topic. I'll probably revisit it in the future. If there is anything I didn't touch on, any disagreements you have, anything you want to discuss further, go ahead and leave it in the comment box. Remember, I got my breathing and bracing ebook in the description. It's 50 pages long and it's absolutely free. It just goes over the philosophy of how you optimize control over your midsection to keep yourself safe, to make yourself efficient, and to ultimately increase your performance. Until next time, this is Bromley at Empire Barbell. I'll see you.